That junk mechanic could barely fix a lawnmower, let alone build anything important. The laughter spread across the community innovation fair like a wave. People smiled. Some shook their heads. Others did not even bother hiding their amusement. Standing near the edge of the exhibition area, Ethan Carter simply continued arranging a few worn tools on a folding table beside an old display board. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He did not even look toward the group that had mocked him. The late afternoon sun stretched across the small town square, while visitors moved between booths showcasing new technology, local businesses, and student engineering projects. A banner overhead fluttered gently in the breeze. Children ran between exhibits. Food trucks lined the parking lot. It should have been a pleasant day. Instead, Ethan had become the unofficial joke of the event. Look at his display. What is that supposed to be? Probably another pile of scrap metal. More laughter followed. Ethan heard every word. He simply smiled politely and continued his work. Across the square, Claire Donovan stood speaking with reporters. As the chief executive officer of a successful technology company, she was one of the event's featured guests. Cameras followed her wherever she went. Investors respected her. Entrepreneurs admired her. When she noticed the small crowd laughing near Ethan's booth, curiosity pulled her attention in that direction. One reporter beside her smiled. "That is Ethan Carter." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "Local mechanic." The reporter chuckled. "Always working on strange projects. Nobody knows why." Claire glanced toward Ethan. The booth looked unimpressive. The sign was old. The display seemed unfinished. Nothing about it suggested innovation. "Interesting," she said, though she clearly did not mean it. Meanwhile, 12-year-old Sophie Carter stood beside her father holding a notebook against her chest. She hated days like this. She hated watching people underestimate him. "Dad," she whispered. "You could tell them." Ethan looked down at her and smiled. "Tell them what?" Sophie frowned. "That they are wrong." Ethan gently adjusted the brim of her baseball cap. People are allowed to think what they want, even when they are being unfair. Ethan nodded. "Especially then." Sophie sighed. She had heard answers like that her entire life. The problem was that they never seemed to make things easier. Nearby, another visitor walked past Ethan's table and laughed. "You should stick to changing oil." More chuckles followed. Ethan simply thanked the man for stopping by. The response seemed to confuse him. He walked away without another word. As the afternoon continued, visitors ignored Ethan's booth almost completely. They gathered around more exciting displays. Robots, drones, software demonstrations, virtual reality headsets. Nobody seemed interested in a quiet mechanic standing beside a collection of sketches and metal components. Nobody except Sophie. She noticed something most people missed. Every drawing on the display board connected to something larger. Every sketch seemed part of a single idea. She had seen similar papers before. Late at night, hidden behind a locked door at the back of their garage. A place her father never talked about. A place nobody else ever entered. As the fair neared its end, Claire finally wandered over. Not because she found the display impressive, because she found the situation amusing. She studied the drawings briefly. What exactly is all this? Ethan looked up. Just ideas. Claire smiled politely. Ideas for what? Ethan hesitated. Something I have been working on. Claire glanced at the scattered parts on the table. Looks ambitious for a mechanic. Several nearby visitors laughed again. Sophie felt her cheeks burn. Ethan remained calm. Maybe. Claire folded her arms. You know, innovation usually requires resources. That is true. And expertise. Ethan nodded. That too. Claire waited for an argument. None came. Eventually, she shook her head and walked away. The conversation had been disappointingly one-sided. As the crowd dispersed and booths began closing, Ethan packed his materials into several old storage boxes. The sun dipped lower behind the buildings. Long shadows stretched across the emptying square. Sophie helped carry supplies toward their pickup truck. Before climbing into the passenger seat, she looked back one final time. Most people had already forgotten her father's booth. Most people had already moved on with their evening. What none of them knew was that hidden behind a reinforced wall inside Ethan Carter's garage sat a project unlike anything they could imagine. And hundreds of miles away, a group of engineers had just discovered a mysterious design that should not have existed, signed only with a name they had spent months trying to find. Ethan Carter woke before dawn the next morning, long before the town came alive. The sky outside was still dark when he stepped into the kitchen and started a pot of coffee. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of wind moving through the trees. For a few minutes, he simply stood by the window, watching the first hints of morning appear beyond the fields. Then the day began. He packed Sophie's lunch. He reviewed the repair orders waiting at the garage. He washed a few dishes left from the previous night. Nothing about his routine looked remarkable. Nothing about it suggested that somewhere behind the walls of his garage existed an idea that had captured the attention of some of the brightest engineering minds in the country. A few minutes later, Sophie walked into the kitchen rubbing her eyes. "Good morning, Dad." Ethan smiled. "Morning, kiddo." She sat down at the table and accepted a plate of pancakes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sophie finally asked the question she had been thinking about since the fair. "Why do you let people laugh at you?" Ethan took a sip of coffee. "Because laughter is not dangerous." Sophie frowned. "It still hurts." Ethan nodded. "Sometimes." "Then why not prove them wrong?" He smiled gently. "Not every misunderstanding needs a fight." Sophie looked unconvinced. Ethan had a way of answering questions that sounded simple, but somehow took years to understand. After breakfast, he drove her to school in his aging pickup truck. The town passed by slowly outside the windows. Small businesses opened their doors. Farmers headed toward the fields. Neighbors waved as they passed. Most people knew Ethan as the mechanic who could repair almost anything. Very few knew anything else about him. "See you this afternoon," Ethan said as Sophie climbed out. "Love you, Dad." "Love you too." She disappeared through the school entrance while Ethan headed toward the garage. The building sat on the edge of town beside a grain storage facility. The paint had faded years ago. The sign above the entrance leaned slightly to one side. Yet customers kept coming because Ethan's work spoke louder than appearances. By 8 o'clock, the first vehicles had already arrived. A rancher needed help with a hydraulic system. A delivery driver needed engine repairs. A local farmer stopped by with questions about an irrigation pump. Ethan moved through the morning quietly, solving problems one at a time. No speeches, no complaints, no rush for recognition. Around noon, his longtime friend and assistant, Jake Morrison, walked into the office holding a phone. "You are famous again." Ethan groaned softly. "Please tell me that is not about the fair." Jake laughed. "It is exactly about the fair." He held up the screen. Several clips from the event had gone viral online. Thousands of comments debated whether Ethan was a misunderstood inventor or simply an eccentric mechanic. "People have a lot of free time," Ethan observed. Jake shook his head. "Most people would be furious." Ethan returned to organizing repair invoices. "Most people are not busy fixing tractors." Jake laughed so hard he nearly dropped the phone. The afternoon passed peacefully. Customers came and went. Tools clattered. Engines hummed. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet every so often Ethan found himself glancing toward the rear of the building. Beyond a locked steel door sat a workshop nobody else entered. Even Jake had never seen inside. The room contained years of work. Years of calculations, years of failures and improvements. It was the one part of his life he never discussed. Late that afternoon, after the last customer left, Ethan locked the front entrance and headed toward the back. He entered a security code and opened the steel door. The workshop beyond looked completely different from the rest of the garage. Precision instruments lined the walls. Complex diagrams covered whiteboards. Prototypes rested on workbenches. Every inch of the room reflected extraordinary discipline and intelligence. Ethan switched on a row of overhead lights and studied the project at the center of the room. He made several notes, adjusted a component, reviewed a set of calculations. Hours passed unnoticed. Outside, the sun slowly began setting over the town. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, inside a government research facility, Dr. Michael Reeves stared at a digital blueprint projected across a conference room screen. Several engineers stood beside him. Nobody spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, one of them broke the silence. "Have we identified the designer?" Dr. Reeves slowly nodded. The room waited. Then he looked at the file in his hands and spoke a name that surprised everyone. "Ethan Carter." Dr. Michael Reeves placed the file on the conference table and looked around the room. The engineers gathered before him were among the most experienced specialists in their field. They had spent months analyzing an unusual design that appeared through a series of technical submissions and archived research exchanges. Every calculation checked out. Every simulation produced extraordinary results. The only mystery was the person behind it. "You are telling me the designer owns a repair garage?" one engineer asked. Dr. Reeves nodded. "That is what the records show." Another engineer frowned. "There has to be a mistake." "We thought so too." Dr. Reeves tapped a stack of documents. "There is not." Silence settled over the room. On the large screen behind them, a photograph of Ethan Carter appeared. It had been taken from a local business license application several years earlier. Nothing about the image looked remarkable. A middle-aged man. Plain shirt. Calm expression. Certainly not the image most people associated with revolutionary engineering concepts. Yet the evidence sitting on the table suggested otherwise. "What happened to him?" someone finally asked. Dr. Reeves studied the file. "That is what we are trying to understand." Meanwhile, back in the small town, Ethan finished another long day at the garage. The sun had disappeared below the horizon. The streets glowed beneath warm, yellow streetlights. Most businesses were closing for the night. Ethan locked the front entrance and headed toward the house. Sophie was waiting at the kitchen table, surrounded by school papers and science homework. "You are late," she said. Ethan smiled. "Sorry." "Workshop." Ethan nodded. Sophie grinned knowingly. "Workshop." They shared a simple dinner together. Conversation drifted between school projects, teachers, and weekend plans. To anyone watching, they looked like an ordinary father and daughter. And that was exactly how Ethan preferred it. Later that evening, after Sophie went to bed, Ethan stepped outside onto the back porch. The night air felt cool. Crickets chirped somewhere beyond the trees. For a few quiet moments, he simply sat and listened. Then his eyes drifted toward the garage. The lights inside the hidden workshop were still on. Most people believed Ethan spent his nights repairing engines or organizing tools. Nobody knew he spent countless hours refining ideas that existed years ahead of their time. Nobody except perhaps Sophie, who understood more than he realized. The following afternoon, Sophie returned home from school carrying a backpack stuffed with books. As she entered the garage office, she noticed something unusual. Ethan was not working on a vehicle. Instead, he sat at a desk reviewing pages of handwritten calculations. He quickly covered them when he noticed her. Sophie laughed. "You always do that." Ethan smiled. "Do what?" "Hide things." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Maybe I just like surprises." Sophie folded her arms. "Or maybe you are building something crazy." Ethan chuckled. "Maybe a little of both." Her eyes wandered toward the steel door at the rear of the building. The same door that remained locked every day. The same door nobody entered except Ethan. "What is really in there?" she asked. Ethan followed her gaze. For a brief moment, his expression softened. "Years of unfinished ideas." "That sounds mysterious." "It is mostly paperwork." Sophie laughed. "I do not believe you." Neither of them noticed the black SUV parked across the street. Its occupants had arrived nearly 20 minutes earlier. They were not customers. They were not from town. And they had spent most of the afternoon quietly observing the garage. One man inside the vehicle lowered a pair of binoculars. "That is him." The woman beside him reviewed a folder. "Hard to believe." "I know." The man looked toward Ethan through the office window. "You would never guess." Back inside, Sophie eventually headed into the house while Ethan returned to work. The hidden workshop waited beyond the steel door. Whiteboards filled with equations covered the walls. Models and prototypes occupied nearly every available surface. At the center of the room stood the project consuming most of his attention. He studied it carefully, adjusted several settings, reviewed another sequence of calculations. The work absorbed him completely. Hours passed. Outside, the black SUV remained parked beneath the fading evening sky. The occupants made notes, reviewed files, and exchanged quiet observations. By the time they finally drove away, one conclusion had become impossible to ignore. The man everyone dismissed as a small-town mechanic was exactly the person they had been searching for. The next few days passed with an unusual feeling hanging over Ethan Carter's garage. Nothing obvious had changed. Customers still arrived every morning. Engines still needed repairs. Farmers still called with questions. Yet somewhere beneath the familiar routine, something felt different. Ethan noticed it first when a man he had never seen before stopped by asking oddly specific technical questions. The visitor claimed he was interested in agricultural equipment, but his questions focused on advanced materials, thermal efficiency, and design tolerances. Ethan answered politely while continuing his work. The man left 20 minutes later looking more interested than when he arrived. The following day, another visitor appeared. Then another. None of them seemed interested in vehicle repairs. They studied the garage. They observed Ethan. They asked questions that did not belong in a small-town repair shop. Ethan noticed the pattern immediately. He simply chose not to comment on it. Meanwhile, Sophie noticed something else. Her father had begun spending even more time in the locked workshop behind the steel door. Every evening after dinner, he disappeared into the room for hours. Sometimes she could hear the faint sound of equipment operating. Other times the workshop remained completely silent. One evening she finally decided to ask again, "Dad, are you ever going to show me what is in there?" Ethan looked up from washing dishes. One day, Sophie smiled. "That is what you said last year." Ethan laughed softly. "Then I suppose I am being consistent." Sophie rolled her eyes. "You know that is not an answer." Ethan dried his hands and looked toward the garage through the kitchen window. The workshop lights glowed faintly in the darkness. "Some things take time," he said quietly. Sophie followed his gaze. "Because they are important?" Ethan nodded. "Because they are unfinished." Later that night, after Sophie went to bed, Ethan entered the workshop and closed the steel door behind him. Whiteboards covered with calculations surrounded the room. Shelves held prototypes, models, and years of research. At the center stood the project that had consumed countless late nights. Ethan studied several readings displayed across a monitor. He adjusted a setting and recorded the results in a notebook already filled with thousands of observations. Most people assumed brilliance looked dramatic. They imagined speeches, awards, headlines, and recognition. The reality was much quieter. It looked like one man standing alone in a garage at midnight refining the same idea for the 100th time because he believed it could still be improved. Hundreds of miles away, Dr. Michael Reeves sat inside another conference room reviewing a growing collection of information about Ethan Carter. The file had become surprisingly large. Employment records, academic records, patent applications that were never completed, research papers published under obscure references. The more they investigated, the stranger the story became. One engineer looked up from a report. "This does not make sense." Dr. Reeves nodded. "I know. According to these records, he could have worked almost anywhere." "Yes. Then why is he repairing trucks in a small town?" Nobody had an answer. The room fell silent. Finally, Dr. Reeves opened another document. The photograph attached showed a younger Ethan standing beside a university engineering team nearly 20 years earlier. Several people in the picture later became leaders in major technology companies. Others joined government research programs. Ethan Carter seemed to be the only one who vanished. "What happened?" someone asked. Dr. Reeves studied the photograph for a moment. "I think life happened." Back in town, Claire Donovan found herself thinking about Ethan more often than she expected. At first, she dismissed the thought. Then she watched additional footage from the Innovation Fair. Then she reviewed photographs of the display everyone had laughed at. Something bothered her. The sketches she initially ignored suddenly looked different. More detailed. More deliberate. The work of someone who understood far more than he revealed. For the first time, doubt entered her mind. Perhaps she had misjudged him. Perhaps everyone had. The next morning, before sunrise touched the horizon, 3 separate vehicles turned onto the highway leading toward Ethan's town. Inside sat people carrying files, research notes, and one very specific destination. They were no longer searching for Ethan Carter. They had found him. Now they intended to meet him. The morning began like any other morning in town. Ethan Carter unlocked the garage a few minutes before 7 o'clock, switched on the lights, and reviewed the repair orders waiting on his desk. Outside, the first rays of sunlight stretched across the empty parking lot. A delivery truck rumbled past on the highway. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. Everything felt ordinary. Yet before the day was over, ordinary would become impossible. Jake Morrison arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You look tired," he said. Ethan accepted the cup with a smile. "Long night." "Workshop." Ethan nodded. Jake laughed. "One day I am going to find out what is actually in there." Ethan glanced toward the steel door at the rear of the building. "Probably not." Jake shook his head. "You know that only makes people more curious." Before Ethan could answer, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the parking lot. Both men looked through the front window. 3 dark SUVs had just turned into the driveway. They were newer than anything usually seen in town. Clean. Professional. Completely out of place beside tractors and pickup trucks. Jake frowned. Those are not customers. Ethan studied the vehicles quietly. Something about them felt familiar. Not the people. The purpose. The kind of arrival that happens when someone comes looking for answers rather than repairs. The doors opened. Several men and women stepped out carrying briefcases and folders. They looked around briefly before heading toward the garage entrance. Jake lowered his voice. Do you know them? Ethan shook his head. Not personally. The group entered moments later. Their eyes moved across the shop carefully, taking in every detail. One of the visitors, a silver-haired man wearing a simple navy jacket, stepped forward first. Good morning. Ethan nodded politely. Morning. The man offered a handshake. My name is Dr. Michael Reeves. Ethan immediately recognized the name. Jake did not. Nice to meet you. Ethan replied calmly. Dr. Reeves smiled. I think we have been trying to meet you for quite some time. Jake looked back and forth between them. Something unusual was clearly happening. Dr. Reeves opened a folder and removed several documents. We recently identified the source of a series of engineering concepts that have attracted significant attention. Ethan remained silent. The visitors exchanged glances. Dr. Reeves continued. Those concepts led us here. The garage suddenly felt much quieter. Tools rested untouched. Engines sat half-repaired. Even Jake stopped moving. Ethan looked down at the papers. He recognized them immediately. Technical diagrams. Prototype models. Research calculations. Some of them dated back years. You found those? Ethan asked. Dr. Reeves laughed softly. Eventually, one of the younger engineers stepped forward. Do you realize how extraordinary some of these designs are? Ethan shrugged slightly. They are just ideas. The group exchanged another look. Several of them smiled in disbelief. The response sounded exactly like the reports describing him. Brilliant. Humble. Completely uninterested in impressing anyone. Meanwhile, across town, Claire Donovan sat inside a conference room reviewing quarterly reports when her phone buzzed. A message from a business associate appeared on the screen. It contained a photograph. Claire stared at it. The image showed multiple black SUVs parked outside Ethan Carter's garage. Her eyebrows lifted immediately. The accompanying message contained only 4 words. Something interesting is happening. Back at the garage, Dr. Reeves studied Ethan carefully. May we ask a question? Ethan nodded. Of course. The engineer opened another file. Why did you stop? Ethan seemed confused. Stop what? Research. The room fell silent. Ethan looked toward the workshop door for several seconds before answering. I never stopped. Nobody spoke. Dr. Reeves smiled slowly. That is what we suspected. The engineers glanced around the garage. Their curiosity was becoming impossible to hide. Finally, one of them asked the question everyone had been thinking. Is the workshop back there? Ethan followed the direction of the engineer's gaze. The steel door stood quietly at the rear of the building. Years of work waited beyond it. Years of secrets. Years of ideas nobody else had seen. Jake looked just as interested as the visitors. Ethan considered the request. Then he smiled faintly. I suppose it is time. As he reached into his pocket for the access key, nobody inside the garage realized they were standing only moments away from a discovery that would change how the entire town saw Ethan Carter forever. The garage fell completely silent as Ethan Carter walked toward the steel door at the rear of the building. Even Jake Morrison stopped breathing for a moment. For years, that door had remained closed to everyone except Ethan. Customers joked about it. Friends speculated about it. Sophie asked about it countless times. Nobody had ever crossed the threshold. Now, for the first time, Ethan was reaching for the access key. Dr. Michael Reeves and the engineers watched carefully. Their curiosity had already transformed into anticipation. Ethan entered the security code, inserted the key, and unlocked the door. A soft mechanical click echoed through the shop. Then he pulled the handle. The door opened slowly. Nobody spoke. The engineers stepped forward first. Jake followed. The moment they entered, every conversation stopped. The workshop looked nothing like a mechanic's workspace. Clean white lighting illuminated rows of precision equipment. Large digital displays covered one wall. Whiteboards filled with equations stretched across another. Technical models occupied workbenches arranged with remarkable organization. Every surface reflected years of disciplined research and development. One engineer blinked twice as if trying to process what he was seeing. Another slowly removed his glasses. Dr. Reeves simply stood still. For several seconds, nobody said a word. The room itself seemed to command silence. Jake finally spoke first. Ethan. His voice barely rose above a whisper. What is all this? Ethan looked around the workshop as though it were perfectly ordinary. Projects. Jake laughed nervously. These are not projects. He pointed toward a sophisticated prototype positioned near the center of the room. I do not even know what that is. Ethan smiled. Most people do not. The engineers began moving carefully through the workshop. Every few feet, they stopped to examine another design, another model, another set of calculations. The deeper they looked, the quieter they became. One engineer reached a whiteboard covered with mathematical solutions and stared at it for nearly a minute. This cannot be right. Another engineer walked over. What? These efficiency calculations. He pointed toward the equations. They exceed our projected benchmarks. The second engineer reviewed them. Then a third joined. Soon 4 people stood in front of the same board. None of them found an error. Dr. Reeves slowly approached a workbench containing a partially assembled prototype. His eyes widened immediately. You actually built it. Ethan nodded. Most of it. Most of it. Dr. Reeves looked genuinely astonished. Do you understand how many research teams have been trying to solve this problem? Ethan shrugged. I had some free evenings. Several engineers laughed softly. Not because the comment was funny, because it sounded impossible. Yet the evidence surrounded them. Sophie arrived from school about 20 minutes later. She entered the garage carrying her backpack and immediately noticed the unfamiliar vehicles outside. Curious, she stepped through the front entrance. The moment she saw the visitors gathered near the workshop, she stopped. Dad. Ethan turned and smiled. Hey, kiddo. Sophie walked toward the group. What is happening? Jake looked at her and laughed. Apparently your father forgot to mention he is secretly one of the smartest people in America. Sophie smiled. I already suspected that. The engineers laughed. Ethan looked embarrassed. Dr. Reeves approached Sophie and offered his hand. You must be Sophie. She nodded. Yes, sir. Your father has been keeping some very impressive secrets. Sophie glanced into the workshop and finally saw everything for herself. The room she had wondered about for years stretched before her. Models. Designs, equipment, ideas, a lifetime of work hidden behind a simple steel door. Her eyes widened. You built all this. Ethan nodded. Most of it. Sophie looked around in disbelief. Why did you never tell me? Ethan smiled gently. Because none of it mattered more than you. The room became quiet again. Different this time. Not because of engineering. Because of truth. Dr. Reeves looked at Ethan carefully. The reports had described a brilliant designer. What they failed to describe was the man himself. The humility, the patience, the complete absence of ego. Finally, the engineer who had doubted the record spoke. You could have worked anywhere. Ethan nodded. Probably. You could have led major programs. Maybe. Then why stay here? Ethan looked toward Sophie. The answer appeared before he spoke. Because this was where I needed to be. Nobody challenged the response. Nobody questioned it. In that moment, every person in the workshop understood something important. The greatest thing Ethan Carter had built was not sitting on a workbench. It was the life he chose when nobody was watching. And as the engineers continued exploring the workshop, one realization became impossible to ignore. They had not come to discover a forgotten mechanic. They had just discovered a forgotten genius. News travels quickly in a small town. By the following morning, nearly everyone had heard some version of the story. The mechanic with the old garage, the mysterious workshop, the group of elite engineers who arrived without warning. The rumors grew larger with every retelling. Some people exaggerated details. Others invented entirely new ones. Yet the basic truth remained the same. Something extraordinary had been discovered behind a steel door nobody had ever been allowed to open. Ethan Carter, meanwhile, seemed completely unaffected by the attention. He unlocked the garage at 7 o'clock sharp, poured himself a cup of coffee, and began working on a delivery truck that needed repairs. When Jake arrived, he found 3 local reporters already standing outside. You are famous now, Jake announced. Ethan groaned. That sounds exhausting. It probably is. Jake pointed toward the reporters. What do you want me to tell them? Ethan smiled. Tell them I repair vehicles. Jake laughed. Nobody is going to believe that anymore. Across town, Claire Donovan sat in her office staring at several photographs that had appeared online overnight. One image showed engineers gathered around Ethan's workshop. Another showed Dr. Michael Reeves studying a prototype with obvious admiration. The more Claire learned, the more uncomfortable she felt about the innovation fair. She remembered the comments, the laughter, her own assumptions. At the time, Ethan had simply smiled and accepted it. Now she found herself wondering how many opportunities she had missed by judging appearances instead of character. Back at the garage, the engineers returned shortly before noon. This time they carried additional equipment, notebooks, and technical specialists. The atmosphere felt different, less like curiosity, more like respect. Dr. Reeves entered first and immediately found Ethan working beneath the hood of a pickup truck. "You know," the engineer said, "most people would have taken the day off after yesterday." Ethan tightened a bolt before looking up. "The truck still needs repairs." Several engineers smiled. They were beginning to understand him. The group spent the afternoon inside the workshop reviewing designs, discussing concepts, and asking questions. Sophie arrived after school and quietly listened from the corner of the room. She enjoyed watching the visitors react. Every few minutes someone would discover another notebook, another prototype, or another solution that left them speechless. One engineer stopped beside a shelf filled with worn binders. "What are these?" Ethan glanced over. "Old research." The engineer opened one carefully. His eyes widened almost immediately. Page after page contained highly detailed calculations and design concepts. "There are years of work here." Ethan nodded. "About 15. The engineer slowly closed the binder. "You did all this alone?" Ethan smiled. "Mostly." Silence followed. The answer impressed everyone more than any speech could have. Later that afternoon, Dr. Reeves gathered several team members around a conference screen they had temporarily installed inside the workshop. Sophie watched as they displayed archived records, engineering publications, and academic references connected to Ethan's past. For the first time, pieces of a much larger story began coming together. One younger engineer looked at the information in disbelief. "You were publishing advanced research before most of us finished college." Ethan laughed softly. "That was a long time ago." Dr. Reeves shook his head. "It was important work." Ethan looked toward Sophie. "I had other priorities." The room understood exactly what he meant. There was no bitterness in his voice, no regret, only certainty. He had chosen family when life demanded it, not because it was easy, because it mattered. Meanwhile, outside the garage, more people continued gathering throughout the afternoon. Neighbors, business owners, curious residents. Some came hoping to see the engineers. Others simply wanted to understand what was happening. Among them stood Claire Donovan. She remained near the edge of the crowd, quietly observing. Through the workshop window, she could see Ethan speaking with the visiting team. For the first time, she noticed something she had completely missed at the fair. Confidence. Not the loud kind. Not the attention-seeking kind. The quiet confidence of someone who never needed approval because he already knew who he was. As evening approached, one of the engineers finally asked the question everyone had been thinking. "Do you realize how significant this work is?" Ethan looked around the workshop. At the notebooks, the prototypes, the years of effort hidden from the world. Then he smiled. "I know it still needs improvement." The room erupted with laughter. Even Dr. Reeves shook his head in disbelief. Yet beneath the laughter sat something deeper. Admiration. Because the more they learned about Ethan Carter, the more impossible it became not to respect him. 3 days later, the small town no longer felt quite the same. The rumors had evolved into certainty. Ethan Carter was no longer known only as the quiet mechanic with the aging garage. People now spoke about him with curiosity, admiration, and disbelief. Yet despite all the attention, Ethan's daily routine remained unchanged. He still woke before sunrise. He still packed Sophie's lunch. He still opened the garage at 7 o'clock sharp. He still greeted customers with the same calm smile he had worn for years. The difference was that people were finally paying attention. That morning, Dr. Michael Reeves arrived carrying a thick folder. Several engineers followed behind him. Their expressions suggested they had reached an important conclusion. Ethan noticed immediately. "Something on your mind?" he asked. Dr. Reeves smiled. "Quite a few things." They gathered inside the workshop while Sophie sat nearby, finishing homework. Jake leaned against a workbench, eager to hear whatever had brought such serious expressions to the room. Dr. Reeves opened the folder and carefully removed several documents. "We finished reviewing your records." Ethan sighed softly. "That sounds dangerous." The engineers laughed. Dr. Reeves continued. You never told anyone who you were. Ethan shrugged. I did not think it mattered. The room exchanged knowing smiles. It mattered now. Dr. Reeves placed several photographs on the table. One showed a much younger Ethan standing inside a university laboratory. Another showed him presenting research at a national engineering conference. A third showed him working alongside some of the most respected technical minds of his generation. Sophie stared at the images in amazement. Dad, Ethan looked down at the photographs. That was a long time ago. Dr. Reeves nodded. Perhaps. But the work was extraordinary. One engineer stepped forward. You graduated years ahead of schedule. Another added, several of your research concepts are still being referenced today. A third shook his head. You were considered one of the most promising engineering minds in the country. Sophie slowly looked from the photographs to her father. For years she had known he was intelligent. She knew he could fix almost anything. She knew people often underestimated him. But this was something entirely different. This was a part of his life he had never shared. Ethan remained quiet. The attention clearly made him uncomfortable. Dr. Reeves understood that. There is more. Ethan laughed softly. Of course there is. The engineer opened another file. You declined multiple offers. Yes. Research leadership positions. Yes. Major technology companies. Ethan nodded. Those two. Jake stared at him. You turned all of that down? Ethan smiled. Apparently. The workshop erupted with disbelief. To many people, those opportunities represented dream careers. Yet Ethan had simply walked away. Finally, Sophie asked the question nobody else wanted to ask. Why? The room became silent. Ethan looked at his daughter. For several moments, he seemed to search for the right words. Then he smiled. Because life changed. Sophie listened carefully. Ethan continued. After your mother passed away, I had a choice. The room remained perfectly still. I could spend my life chasing achievements. He paused. Or I could spend my life raising the person who mattered most. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. The answer was simple, honest, complete. Dr. Reeves looked down at the floor. Several engineers did the same. Suddenly the story made sense. Ethan had never disappeared because he failed. He never disappeared because he lost his talent. He simply chose something more important. The realization changed everything. Later that afternoon, Claire Donovan arrived at the garage. This time she did not come as a skeptical observer. She came as someone seeking understanding. She found Ethan standing outside speaking with customers. Do you have a minute? She asked. Ethan smiled politely. Of course. Claire looked around at the garage, the workshop, and the growing number of visitors. Then she shook her head. I misjudged you. Ethan did not appear surprised. It happens. Claire laughed softly. Most people would not be this gracious. Ethan looked towards Sophie through the workshop window. Life is too short to spend it being angry. Claire followed his gaze. For the first time, she understood why everyone who truly knew Ethan respected him so deeply. It was not because he was brilliant. It was not because of the designs. It was not because of the engineers who traveled across the country to find him. It was because greatness had never changed him. And as the afternoon sunlight filled the workshop, the forgotten story of Ethan Carter was finally becoming visible to the world. The weeks that followed brought changes to Ethan Carter's life, but not in the way most people expected. The engineers returned several times. Research discussions continued. Technical reviews filled notebooks and conference calls. Opportunities arrived from organizations that once would have seemed impossible. Yet every morning, Ethan still unlocked the garage at 7 o'clock. He still greeted customers by name. He still repaired engines, solved problems, and helped neighbors who could not afford expensive repairs. Fame had finally found him, but it never managed to change him. One afternoon, Dr. Michael Reeves stood beside Ethan outside the garage watching Sophie ride her bicycle across the parking lot. The late afternoon sun painted the sky with shades of gold and orange. The town felt peaceful. You know, Dr. Reeves said, most people still cannot understand why you walked away from everything. Ethan smiled. I did not walk away from everything. The engineer looked at him curiously. Ethan nodded toward Sophie. I walked toward something. Dr. Reeves followed his gaze and smiled. After all the reports, all the research, and all the discoveries, that answer explained more than any file ever could. Across town, Claire Donovan had quietly become one of Ethan's strongest supporters. She often stopped by the garage simply to talk. Their conversations rarely involved engineering. Instead, they discussed community projects, education programs, and ways to encourage young people to pursue science and innovation. Claire eventually admitted something she had never expected. The biggest lesson I learned from you had nothing to do with technology. Ethan laughed softly. That is good because I am terrible at teaching technology. Claire smiled. No, the lesson was about humility. Ethan shook his head. I am still learning that one myself. Yet everyone who knew him understood the truth. The respect surrounding Ethan no longer came from hidden achievements. It came from the person he chose to be every day. One evening, nearly a month after the engineers first arrived, the town hosted another community gathering in the same square where Ethan had once been mocked. The atmosphere felt completely different now. Families filled the sidewalks. Children explored exhibits. Local businesses showcased projects. At the center of the event stood a new educational display encouraging students to pursue engineering and science. Organizers invited Ethan to speak. Predictably, he tried to decline. They convinced him anyway. As he stepped onto the small stage, the crowd applauded warmly. Ethan looked slightly uncomfortable. Public attention still felt unnatural to him. Sophie stood in the front row smiling proudly. Claire stood nearby. Jake folded his arms and grinned. Dr. Reeves watched from the back of the crowd. Ethan approached the microphone and waited for the applause to fade. Then he said something nobody expected. Most people think success happens because someone is smarter than everyone else. The crowd listened. Ethan shook his head. That has never been true. Silence settled over the square. Success usually comes from showing up when nobody is watching, working when nobody is applauding, learning when nobody notices. Several people nodded. Ethan smiled. And remembering what matters most when life gives you choices. His eyes drifted toward Sophie. The crowd followed his gaze. In that moment, everyone understood exactly what he meant. The applause that followed felt different from any applause Ethan had received before. Not because people admired his accomplishments, because they admired his priorities. Later that night, after the event ended, Ethan and Sophie sat together on the back porch of their house. The stars shone brightly overhead. The air felt cool and peaceful. Sophie leaned against her father and smiled. You know something? Ethan looked down at her. What? She laughed softly. I always knew you were special. Ethan smiled. I think every father hopes his daughter feels that way. Sophie shook her head. No, I mean really special. Ethan looked toward the dark outline of the garage in the distance. The workshop lights were off for once. The projects could wait until tomorrow. Tonight felt complete. The funny thing, Sophie continued, is that none of the important reasons have anything to do with the workshop. Ethan laughed quietly. Good. Sophie squeezed his arm. The important reason is that you never stopped being my dad. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply sat beneath the stars while the world finally understood what Sophie had known all along. The mechanic everyone overlooked never needed recognition to have value. The genius hidden behind a garage never needed applause to prove his worth. His greatest achievement was not what he built. It was the life he built around love, responsibility, and quiet dignity. And if this story reminded you of someone whose strength was hidden behind humility, someone who kept showing up when nobody noticed, share their story in the comments. And if you believe character matters more than recognition, we would be honored to have you join us again for another journey.